The first sign was not the lab report. It was my doctor's hands. They were shaking. Not dramatically, not enough for anyone else in the room to notice, but I did. I watch details for a living. I'm an accountant. Numbers, patterns, irregularities, they're my comfort zone. And that afternoon, sitting on the crinkling paper of an exam table, I noticed the tremor in her fingers before she even spoke. She kept scrolling through my results. Up, down, back up again. Her jaw tightened. I had spent 5 months preparing myself to hear something terminal. Cancer, organ failure, some rare autoimmune disorder. I had rehearsed bravery in the mirror, practiced calm breathing, Googled survival statistics at 2 a.m. I was ready for devastating news. I was not ready for her to stand abruptly and say, "Can you come with me?" She didn't take me to another exam room. She took me to her private office. She closed the door, turned the lock, lowered the blinds halfway. And then she said something that split my life in half. "You need to leave your home as soon as possible. Do not confront anyone. Do not change your behavior until you're somewhere safe." I thought she was joking. She wasn't. Then she turned her monitor toward me. The word on the screen looked clinical, clean, detached. Arsenic. Elevated levels consistent with repeated exposure over time. Not enough to kill instantly, enough to weaken, to deteriorate, to mimic disease. Enough to erase someone quietly. My name is Aya Carnes. I'm 31. I live in Portland, Oregon. I have a master's degree in accounting, a stable career, and until that day, I believed I had a stable marriage. For 5 months, I had been unraveling. It started subtly. I was tired in a way sleep didn't fix. My brain felt wrapped in cotton. I forgot passwords I'd used for years. I reread emails 3 times and still couldn't process them. Then came the nausea, a constant low hum of sickness that never escalated enough to send me to the ER, but never disappeared either. My hair began coming out in strands. Not dramatic bald patches, just enough to scare me every time I brushed it. Doctors offered guesses: stress, vitamin deficiencies, hormonal shifts, burnout. Each appointment ended the same way: inconclusive results and polite reassurance. My husband came to every one. Glenn Reeves, 34, pharmaceutical sales. Confident, polished, the kind of man nurses compliment. He held my hand in waiting rooms, asked intelligent questions, took notes. "You're lucky," a receptionist once told me. "Most husbands don't show up like that." I believed her. 5 months ago, Glenn began making me breakfast smoothies every morning. He said I wasn't eating enough, said he worried about my energy levels, said he wanted to help. They tasted terrible. Green, bitter, earthy in a way that didn't feel natural. But I drank them, because that's what wives do when their husbands say, "I just want you healthy." The symptoms began that same month. When my doctor showed me the toxicology results, the timeline snapped into focus like a spreadsheet balancing after hours of frustration. Controlled dosing, low enough to avoid suspicion, high enough to damage slowly. Glenn works with pharmaceuticals. He understands milligrams, metabolism, half-life. He would know exactly how much to administer. I remember walking out of that clinic into gray Portland drizzle. My phone buzzed before I reached my car. "Hey love, how'd it go? I made lasagna." I stared at the message until the letters blurred. I typed back, "All good, see you soon." Then I sat in my car and let the panic hit in waves. You don't scream when you realize your husband is poisoning you. You calculate. You replay conversations. You ask yourself how many times you kissed him after swallowing something he prepared. I went home that night and hugged him. I sat across from him at dinner and watched his hands. Steady, confident. He asked about the appointment. I told him it was minor anemia. He frowned appropriately, said he'd research supplements. He smiled. I felt cold all the way through. The next morning was the real test. He blended the smoothie, poured it into my usual glass, set it in front of me. I lifted it, took a sip, swallowed. My entire body wanted to spit it out. Instead, I said, "Thank you." I needed time. My doctor had urged me not to change my routine abruptly. If Glenn suspected, I knew he could escalate, increase dosage, switch tactics. So I created a believable adjustment. I told him the new iron supplement couldn't be taken with protein for at least 2 hours. He nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense," he said. "We'll adjust." We. From that day forward, he left the smoothie in the fridge after making it. When he went to work, I poured most of it down the drain. I kept small amounts in my system so the improvement would be gradual, not suspicious. My health began returning slowly. My mind sharpened, and clarity is a terrifying thing. Because once your brain works again, you start noticing patterns. 2 years ago, Glenn suggested he manage our finances. "You already deal with numbers all day," he'd said gently. "Let me take something off your plate." It felt considerate. Now it felt strategic. My friendships had faded gradually too, not because he forbade them. He never raised his voice, never demanded. He sighed. He made subtle comments. "She drains you. You always seem stressed after seeing her. I just want you protected." Eventually, I stopped making plans. Isolation doesn't require locked doors. It just requires suggestion. One afternoon, while Glenn was at work, I accessed the filing cabinet in his home office. I know where people hide things. Inside a folder labeled retirement planning was a life insurance policy. On me, $750,000. Sole beneficiary, Glenn Reeves. Policy initiated 10 months earlier, 4 months before my symptoms began. I sat on the floor and let the paper shake in my hands. This wasn't impulse. This wasn't rage. This was planning. I dug further. Transfers to an unfamiliar account. $40,000 moved slowly over months, categorized as business expenses. Sloppy coding, clean presentation. He underestimated me. He assumed I'd never audit my own marriage. That night, he mentioned meeting a client for dinner. His tone was light, slightly eager. I waited 15 minutes after he left, then followed. The restaurant was downtown, dim, expensive. Through the window, I saw him seated across from a woman I'd never met. Late 20s, dark hair, polished. They leaned close. He touched her wrist. But something felt off. She smiled, yes, but her posture was tight. Her eyes scanned the room. She didn't glow the way someone in love glows. I memorized her face. The next week, I learned her name, Simone Halford. She worked in chemical supply logistics, industrial materials, including arsenic compounds used for manufacturing. My stomach turned, but the pieces still didn't align completely. Why her? Why risk involving another person? Unless she didn't know. That thought lodged itself in my brain and refused to leave. Around this time, Glenn's mother began visiting daily. She brought soup, sat with me, watched me nap. She had never liked me. Now she hovered. One afternoon, I overheard Glenn thanking her on the phone. "Can you check on her tomorrow? I just worry when I'm not home." He was building witnesses, establishing a narrative of concern. If I died, everyone would testify to his devotion. He had layered protection into every angle of my life. Except one. He forgot who I was. I met with a detective recommended by my doctor. I brought copies of everything: insurance policy, bank transfers, lab results. The detective didn't dismiss me, didn't look skeptical. She listened, and when I finished, she said quietly, "We'll need proof of delivery." So I saved one smoothie, stored it carefully. It tested positive, consistent compound levels. Now the question was sourcing, and I knew exactly who to talk to. Simone looked defensive when I approached her at a cafe. I introduced myself. Her face hardened. "She told me you might try something like this." Of course he did. I showed her the toxicology report, then the insurance policy, then I asked one question. "Did he ask you to take out life insurance too?" Her silence was louder than denial. Her hands began to tremble. He had convinced her it was for their future. He had used her work credentials to order materials. He had positioned her as both accomplice and a scapegoat. And suddenly, we weren't rivals. We were targets. That was the moment everything shifted, not just from fear to strategy, but from survival to exposure. Because Glenn's greatest flaw wasn't cruelty, it was arrogance. And arrogant men always believe they're the smartest person in the room. He never imagined the sick wife and the secret girlfriend would compare notes. He never imagined documentation would become his undoing. And he never imagined that the woman he thought he was slowly erasing was taking notes the entire time. The first time Simone and I spoke without hostility between us, the air felt different. Not lighter, sharper. Two women sitting across from each other, realizing the same man had been telling us two completely different stories, and neither one was true. She didn't cry at first. She stared at the insurance documents like they were written in a foreign language. "I thought it was romantic," she finally said. That word landed heavily between us. Romantic. Glenn had framed everything as devotion, long-term planning, protection, stability. He used the language of security to disguise predation. Simone told me they met 14 months earlier at a regional sales conference. Glenn had approached her first, complimented her presentation, asked thoughtful questions, followed up with coffee. Within weeks, he confided in her about his unhappy marriage. He described me as distant, career-obsessed, emotionally unavailable. "He said you didn't want children," she said quietly. "He said you barely noticed him." I almost laughed. Glenn had told me he wasn't ready for kids yet, that we should enjoy our freedom. Predators customize narratives for their audience. 8 months before, he'd suggested they both take out life insurance policies. "If we're building a future, we need to protect it," he'd told her. She'd agreed. $500,000. He was listed as beneficiary. The timing matched too closely to ignore. I asked her about work, about chemical access. That's when the real horror surfaced. Glenn had asked to use her company's procurement login, claiming his firm was overcharging for certain industrial compounds needed for research samples. She worked in accounts administration. She trusted him. She gave him temporary access credentials. She never checked the order history. She never questioned deliveries. Because when someone is whispering about forever, you don't expect them to be ordering poison. Simone went pale as the realization fully settled. "If they trace the purchase," she whispered, "it leads to me." Exactly. Glenn hadn't just been poisoning me, he had been constructing a fallback narrative. If suspicion ever surfaced, Simone's digital trail would absorb it. She would look like the jealous mistress eliminating the wife. He would look like the devastated man caught between two unstable women. The elegance of the setup was chilling. Simone leaned back in her chair, breathing unevenly. "I think I'm next," she said. "You are," I replied. There was no cruelty in it, just fact. That afternoon, we went together to meet Detective Reyes. Simone brought full access logs from her company account, order timestamps, IP addresses, shipment tracking numbers. One entry stood out immediately: arsenic trioxide. Ordered 6 months ago, shipped to a P.O. box across town under the name Gerald Richards, a fake identity. But Glenn had underestimated something critical: surveillance cameras. Detective Reyes obtained footage from the postal facility within days. 3 separate pickups, clear video of Glenn retrieving small, discreetly packaged boxes. No gloves, no disguise. Confidence makes people careless. The case was building quickly now, but Reyes wanted more. "Circumstantial evidence is strong," she said, "but we need his voice tied to intent." Oregon's recording laws were clear: one-party consent. If Simone recorded her conversations with Glenn, they were admissible. She agreed immediately. The transformation in her was remarkable. Gone was the defensive woman protecting a fantasy relationship. In her place was someone coldly focused on survival. She met Glenn for dinner 2 nights later. She wore a small recording device in her purse. He arrived, smiling, confident, unaware that the narrative was collapsing around him. The audio from that first recording made my stomach twist. He spoke about me like I was already gone. "She's fading," he told Simone softly. "Doctors can't figure it out. It's tragic." There was no sadness in his tone, only anticipation. Simone gently prompted him. "What happens when, He didn't hesitate. "I'll handle the arrangements. Insurance will make things easier. Then we won't have to hide anymore." Insurance. Not grief, not loss. Logistics. Reyes listened to the recording twice. She said, "Good, but we need him discussing timing." Meanwhile, at home, I performed weakness. I walked slower, let my shoulders slump, mentioned dizziness. Glenn's attentiveness intensified. He brought herbal teas, researched support groups. Once, he even suggested reducing my workload. "You need rest," he insisted. I watched him carefully. He never once suggested a specialist outside our immediate network, never pushed for advanced toxicology screening, because he already knew what was in my bloodstream. The psychological toll was immense. Sleeping beside someone who calculates your decline changes your nervous system. Every creak in the house sounded deliberate. Every touch felt strategic. But clarity is armor. I reminded myself daily, he believes he's ahead. That belief is our advantage. Simone continued recording. In one conversation, Glenn mentioned a few more weeks. He said it casually, as if discussing a home renovation timeline. Reyes's expression hardened when she heard that. She said, "That's premeditation language." Still, we needed something from me directly, a conversation where Glenn acknowledged the life insurance policy and my deteriorating health in the same breath. Reyes asked if I would wear a wire. I didn't hesitate. If I could endure 5 months of poisoning, I could endure one dangerous conversation. The device was small, barely noticeable under fabric. Na, my best friend, who had re-entered my life once I told her everything, helped attach it. She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't need to. She just squeezed my hand and said, "End this." That night, I set the stage. I brought up the future, quietly, cautiously. "I've been thinking," I told Glenn, sitting at the kitchen table. "What happens if I don't get better?" He immediately reached for my hand. "You will." "But if I don't?" He sighed, not distressed, measured. "We'll deal with whatever comes." I mentioned the insurance policy specifically. "I'm glad we set that up. At least you'll be financially secure." There was a pause. Then, "I'll take care of everything." He didn't protest the premise, didn't say the money didn't matter, didn't say he couldn't imagine life without me. He accepted it. Later that evening, after he thought I'd fallen asleep, he stepped into the hallway. The wire was still active. He called Simone. "She's getting weaker," he said softly. "It won't drag out much longer." The excitement in his voice was subtle, but undeniable. That recording sealed it. The warrant was approved the next morning, but Reyes advised waiting one more day. They wanted Glenn comfortable, routine, predictable. The final night was surreal. He made dinner, asked about my symptoms, kissed my forehead before bed. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, aware that it was the last time I would ever share space with him as his wife. In the morning, he left for work as usual. 20 minutes later, he returned. Not alone. Detective Reyes and 2 uniformed officers stood behind him. His face shifted instantly when he saw me in the kitchen. Confusion, then calculation, then something blank. He didn't shout, didn't panic. He assessed. "Glenn Reeves," Detective Reyes said evenly, "you are under arrest for attempted first-degree murder and insurance fraud." For the first time in years, I saw his real expression. Not loving, not concerned, cold, strategic. He looked at me once. No apology, no anger, just analysis, trying to find the flaw in his plan. They handcuffed me in our living room. He didn't resist, because resistance would disrupt the image he'd spent years cultivating. Even in arrest, he performed composure. As the door closed behind them, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph, relief, the kind that empties you out completely. The performance was over, but the reckoning was just beginning. The house was too quiet after Glenn was taken away. Silence does something strange when it follows chaos. It doesn't feel peaceful, it feels exposed. I stood in the kitchen long after the police cars disappeared, staring at the indentation on the carpet where he'd been standing in handcuffs. It felt unreal. 5 months of slow poisoning, months of manipulation, years of marriage, and it ended in less than 3 minutes. Detective Reyes stayed behind briefly. "We'll need you downtown later for a formal statement," she said gently. "But for now, breathe." Breathe. It sounded simple, but my body had been in survival mode for so long that I didn't remember how to exist without scanning for threat. That first night alone, I didn't sleep. I kept replaying everything in my mind, not the arrest, but the small moments leading up to it. The tea he handed me, the vitamins he insisted I take, the way he watched me swallow. I realized something disturbing. The poisoning wasn't rushed. It was calibrated. Low doses, gradual symptoms, enough to weaken, not enough to alarm. He had researched this carefully. The next day at the station, I gave a full statement. Not emotional, not dramatic, just facts. Timeline, symptoms, conversations, insurance details. Simone was there too, in a separate room, giving her own account. We didn't speak much. There was nothing left to clarify between us. We were connected now by something darker than rivalry. Evidence began stacking quickly. Forensics searched the house. In the garage, hidden behind seasonal storage bins, they found a small locked case. Inside, latex gloves, measuring spoons, and a digital scale. Trace amounts of arsenic were detected on the scale's surface. The P.O. box lease was traced to a prepaid card purchased with cash, but surveillance footage showed Glenn buying that card weeks before the first chemical shipment. He had thought of everything, except collaboration. He had underestimated that 2 women might compare notes. During interrogation, Glenn asked for an attorney immediately. He didn't deny knowing Simone. He didn't deny the P.O. box. He denied intent. According to his lawyer, the chemicals were for independent research related to product testing. The life insurance policies were standard marital planning. My illness? Unfortunate coincidence. But prosecutors don't build cases on coincidence. They build them on patterns. And Glenn had left a pattern miles wide. Financial analysts discovered something else. 3 months before my symptoms began, Glenn had quietly transferred money into a separate investment account in his name only. He had calculated future liquidity. He had been preparing to move on. When that information reached me, it hurt more than the poisoning. Not because of the money, because it meant he had already erased me from his future. The arraignment was quick. Attempted first-degree murder, insurance fraud, identity fraud for the P.O. box registration, illegal chemical procurement. He pleaded not guilty. Of course he did. In the weeks before trial, my health slowly improved. Without the arsenic entering my system, my body began repairing itself. The headaches faded first, then the nausea. My hair stopped thinning. Each small recovery felt like reclaiming territory. But psychologically, I was fractured. I questioned every memory from our marriage. Our honeymoon, his proposal, quiet Sunday mornings. Was any of it real? Or had I simply been a stable platform for his ambitions? Therapy became essential. Trauma from poisoning isn't just physical, it's intimate betrayal. It's realizing the person who held you at night was measuring out your decline during the day. My therapist said something that shifted everything. Manipulative people don't fake everything, they feel things, just not in the same way you do. That helped, because it meant I hadn't imagined every good moment. It meant he likely enjoyed aspects of our life. He just valued himself more. The trial began 6 months after his arrest. By then, media had caught wind of the story. Sales executive accused of poisoning wife for insurance. Reporters lined the courthouse steps. I kept my head down. Inside the courtroom, Glenn looked almost unchanged. Pressed suit, calm posture, minimal expression. If someone didn't know the details, they'd see a composed, professional man unfairly accused. That was his strength, surface credibility. The prosecution built the case methodically. First, medical experts. They explained arsenic accumulation, symptom progression, dosage patterns. Then, toxicologists linked trace amounts found in the garage tools to my blood work levels. Then, financial experts presented the insurance policies. 2 women, both $500,000 policies, both naming Glenn sole beneficiary, both initiated within the same time frame. The jury took notes. Simone testified first. She described how Glenn portrayed me as unstable, how he convinced her the insurance was romantic, how he used her work credentials. Her voice shook once when she admitted she nearly blamed herself for everything. Then it was my turn. Walking to the witness stand felt like stepping into a version of myself I no longer recognized. I wasn't there as a wife, I was there as evidence. The prosecutor guided me through the timeline. Symptoms, doctor visits, Glenn's reactions. Then they played the recordings. The courtroom was silent as Glenn's voice filled the space. She's fading. A few more weeks. Insurance will make things easier. Hearing it publicly was different. Private dread turned into documented malice. For the first time, I watched jurors look directly at him with visible discomfort. When the defense cross-examined me, they tried to suggest marital stress, implied exaggeration, questioned whether I could be certain about dosage timing. I stayed calm, because certainty didn't come from emotion. It came from toxicology reports. It came from recorded conversations. It came from a digital scale with arsenic residue. The most unexpected moment came during Glenn's testimony. Against his lawyer's advice, he chose to speak. Narcissism often believes it can outperform evidence. He maintained composure at first, described himself as a caring husband, said he was researching chemical distribution inefficiencies, claimed Simone misinterpreted casual comments. But under prosecution questioning, cracks appeared. "Why open a P.O. box under a false name?" the prosecutor asked. "For privacy," he replied. "Why not ship to your home?" Silence. He adjusted his tie. Small gesture, large meaning. The prosecutor then asked, "Did you ever encourage your wife to request advanced toxicology screening?" "No." "Why not?" "I trusted the doctors." It was subtle, but damaging, because any truly concerned spouse pushes for answers when unexplained illness lingers. He had done the opposite. Closing arguments were restrained. No theatrics, just timeline, motive, preparation, execution. The jury deliberated for 2 days. 2 days where I barely ate. 2 days where every possible outcome replayed in my mind. When the verdict came, the courtroom filled quickly. Guilty on all major counts. Attempted first-degree murder, insurance fraud, identity fraud for the P.O. box registration, illegal chemical procurement. He pleaded not guilty. Of course he did. In the weeks following the sentencing, the judge described the crime as calculated, prolonged, and executed with chilling patience. Glenn received 22 years. As deputies led him away, he glanced back once, not at the jury, not at the judge, at me. The look wasn't hatred, it wasn't remorse, it was disbelief, as if he still couldn't reconcile how the plan had failed. Afterwards, reporters asked how I felt. I gave a short statement. I feel alive. Because that was the truth. Justice didn't feel triumphant, it felt stabilizing, like gravity returning after months of disorientation. Simone and I spoke occasionally after the trial, not as close friends, but as people who survived the same architect. She changed jobs. I sold the house. Every object inside it felt contaminated by memory. Recovery wasn't dramatic. It was gradual. Grocery shopping without fear, drinking tea without suspicion, sleeping without scanning for breath patterns beside me. Trust didn't return quickly, but self-trust did, and that mattered more. I had sensed something was wrong. I had followed the discomfort instead of dismissing it. That instinct saved my life. Years from now, people may remember the case as a headline, but for me, it will always be a lesson carved into bone. The most dangerous threats aren't loud, they're patient, and the most powerful defense isn't force, It's awareness. Prison sentencing did not end the story. It only ended the immediate danger. For months after the trial, I woke up each morning disoriented, not because Glenn was gone, but because my body was still waiting for harm that no longer existed. Trauma doesn't switch off when a verdict is read. It lingers in the nervous system. The house sold quickly. I didn't negotiate hard. I didn't want profit from a place that had nearly become my grave. I packed only what felt neutral: clothes, personal journals, a few framed photos from before Glenn entered my life. Everything else stayed: furniture, kitchenware, the tea kettle, especially the tea kettle. I moved into a smaller apartment across town, 3rd floor, large windows, no shared history in the walls. The first night there, I sat on the floor with my back against the couch and listened to ordinary sounds: traffic below, someone laughing in another unit, pipes adjusting to temperature changes. Normal sounds. They felt foreign. For 5 months, I had lived under controlled poisoning. For years before that, I had lived inside controlled perception. Glenn's manipulation hadn't started with chemicals. It had started with small reframes. You're overthinking. That didn't happen the way you remember. You're being dramatic. Gaslighting works because it's incremental. By the time the poisoning began, my confidence in my own interpretation of reality had already been softened. That realization was harder to process than the arsenic. Physical recovery had measurable markers. Blood levels dropped, hair thickened, appetite returned. Psychological recovery had no clear metrics. I began trauma-focused therapy twice a week. The first sessions weren't about Glenn. They were about me. Why had I dismissed early red flags? Why did I minimize discomfort? Why did I prioritize maintaining harmony over investigating doubt? My therapist was careful not to frame those questions as blame. They're patterns, she said. Patterns can be rewritten. That word, rewritten, stayed with me, because for months I had felt defined by what happened: poisoned wife, courtroom victim, headline subject. But those were events, not identity. 6 months after sentencing, I received my first letter from Glenn. The envelope alone tightened my chest. The return address carried the sterile weight of the correctional facility. I didn't open it immediately. I placed it on the kitchen counter and stared at it for nearly an hour. Finally, I slid it open. 3 pages, neat handwriting. No apology. Instead, analysis. He wrote about misinterpretations, about prosecution bias, about how stress had distorted communication. He framed himself as misunderstood. He ended the letter with, "I hope one day you'll see the full picture." There it was again, reality reframed, even from prison. I didn't respond. Instead, I brought the letter to therapy. We dissected it line by line. What struck me most wasn't anger. It was absence. There was no curiosity about my recovery, no acknowledgement of harm, no recognition of fear, just self-preservation. That was the final confirmation I didn't know I needed. The man I married was real in certain moments, but the part capable of poisoning me was equally real. Both could coexist. Accepting that duality closed a door in my mind that had been half open for too long. Around the 1-year mark after the arrest, something subtle shifted. I laughed without forcing it. Not a polite laugh, a spontaneous one. It happened at a bookstore cafe when a stranger mispronounced a complicated drink order and then laughed at himself. I laughed too, and for the first time in over a year, my body didn't check for danger afterward. That's when I understood healing wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. Simone and I met occasionally for coffee. Our connection wasn't built on shared hobbies or natural compatibility. It was built on survival. We spoke less about Glenn and more about ourselves. She admitted she had ignored discomfort too, how he had isolated her from colleagues subtly, how he positioned himself as her primary emotional anchor. We recognized the same structure applied differently: divide, position, control. Understanding the architecture of manipulation made it less mystical, less powerful. 2 years after sentencing, Glenn attempted an appeal: procedural errors, insufficient evidence, recording admissibility challenges. The appeal was denied. I didn't attend. I read the decision summary online. Detached. His legal maneuvers no longer had the power to destabilize me. That was growth. The body remembers, though, even when the mind feels steady. Certain scents, metallic, bitter, triggered nausea. Certain phrases, trust me, especially, activated instant skepticism. Hypervigilance softened over time, but never disappeared entirely. And that's not weakness, it's adaptation. One evening, nearly 3 years after the trial, I found myself holding an old photograph. Our wedding day. We looked radiant, genuine. I studied my face in the image. There was no visible warning, no sign that the man beside me would one day calculate arsenic dosage. For a moment, grief surfaced. Not for him, for the version of myself who believed safety was guaranteed by ceremony. I didn't tear the photo. I didn't burn it. I placed it back in the box. Because denial of history isn't strength. Integration is. The story became something I could tell without shaking. At first to therapists, then to close friends, eventually at a small seminar on psychological manipulation hosted by a local community group. Standing in front of strangers and describing slow poisoning felt surreal. But afterward, 3 women approached me privately. Each had experienced some version of coercive control. Not poison, but financial restriction, isolation, subtle psychological erosion. Patterns repeat across different intensities. Awareness disrupts them. That night, walking home, I felt something I hadn't anticipated. Purpose. Not from suffering, but from articulation. Turning experience into information transforms victimhood into agency. 5 years after Glenn's arrest, I visited the coast alone. A quiet stretch of shoreline with gray water and sharp wind. I stood facing the ocean and realized I no longer framed my life as before and after. It was continuous. The poisoning wasn't a dividing line. It was a chapter. A severe one, but not the conclusion. I thought about trust. Trust isn't blindness. It's informed vulnerability. I would trust again, differently, slower, with attention to consistency rather than charm. Charm fades. Consistency reveals. That distinction took nearly dying to understand. I never remarried. Not out of fear, out of contentment. Independence stopped feeling like recovery and started feeling like preference. I built friendships deeper than any romantic attachment I'd had before. I restructured my finances independently. I traveled. Small trips at first, then larger ones. Each new environment reinforced something essential. The world is bigger than one betrayal. On the 10th anniversary of the arrest, I didn't mark it with ceremony. I didn't need to. But that evening, while washing dishes, I caught my reflection in the window. Strong posture, steady gaze. No fear. That was the anniversary, not the date on the calendar, the absence of fear in my own reflection. If there's a lesson embedded in all of this, it's not about paranoia. It's about attention. Manipulation thrives in unexamined spaces. It grows when intuition is dismissed. It accelerates when discomfort is rationalized away for the sake of peace. Peace built on self-erasure is not peace. It's delay. Glenn once believed he had constructed the perfect sequence: insurance, isolation, gradual poisoning, financial security. What he miscalculated was connection. He assumed rivalry would prevent collaboration. He assumed shame would silence suspicion. He assumed composure would override evidence. He was wrong. The irony is simple. The control he sought cost him all control, and the life he tried to end expanded beyond what he could have anticipated. I don't think about him much now. When I do, it's not with anger. It's with clarity. Some people see relationships as investments, some see them as partnerships, and some see them as leverage. Recognizing the difference is survival. If I could speak to the version of myself sitting at that kitchen table years ago, dizzy and confused, I wouldn't warn her about poison. I would tell her this: you are not imagining the shift. You are not dramatic. You are not overreacting. Trust the pattern, not the promise. Because in the end, quiet control only survives in silence,
and once spoken aloud, it collapses.